Al Jazeera Podcasts.
These artifacts they're not museum pieces. They're things that we use in our community. You see, we didn't use them as art, they were tools.
For over a century, the UK held artefacts that were stolen from the Asante Kingdom in present-day Ghana in the 1800s. Now, these artifacts didn't just hold value in themselves, but they were rich in Ghana's culture and history. They were finally returned in 2024.
Some were looted during wars with the Asante Kingdom. This long-term loan took decades to negotiate and marks the silver jubilee of the Asante King.
Nigeria is also negotiating the return of looted artifacts from art collectors and museums in the US and Europe. The need to restore and reclaim culture through art is ever present. It is a powerful medium, but when the art scene is controlled by Western narratives, can it marginalize voices in the global south, such as Africa?
The interesting thing about contemporary art from Africa is that the majority of gatekeepers of contemporary African art do not look like the artists.
I want to know how African art can be reclaimed and redefined so that African voices are amplified. I'm Samantha Johnson, and this is Now You Know. We're dedicated to amplifying women's voices, stories, and topics we're all thinking and talking about. This is a safe space where we go all in, so by the end of each episode, you can say, Now I Know. Adora Mba is the owner of Adar Contemporary, an art gallery in Accra, Ghana, which presents the work of emerging artists across Africa and its diaspora. Adora's mission is to exhibit African art by Africans in Africa to foster its influence among global audiences. So, Adora, thank you so much for joining us on Now You Know.
Thank you for having me. Hi, Sam. It's been a while.
It's been a while. I mean, I've known Adora for more than 10 years. We used to work together at a news station in London.
Another life,
and what I would
say, right?
When I worked with you, you were in a different department, and you've always worked on culture and art. Like, this is in your blood. I love seeing other women, especially other Black women, glowing and thriving in their field. But tell us how you got into the art industry and why African art is so important to you.
Oh, well, I feel that I'm one of those that I've always loved art. I mean, I think you kind of nailed it when you said that it's in my blood. I grew up in a home that was filled with art. And my father's Nigerian, my mother's from Ghana. But growing up in Lagos, we had a lot of paintings, statues, artwork. My dad used to host exhibitions for Nigerian artists. Art has always been sort of a real kind of love for me. But then, I ended up studying philosophy and then going to journalism, and then kind of navigated the kind of work and the kind of stories I wanted to cover. So back then was always, young Black artists or British Black artists, and then the kind of new emerging artists that were coming out of the continent. But what I found very interesting for me was that growing up in Nigeria, art was not new. It wasn't a new phenomenon. It wasn't, we were used to art markets. We used to art shows, exhibitions, museums, and the rest of it. But when I grew up, came to school in London and then grew up in the UK, I noticed that African art was very, very different and very far away from the international art market, which I found so strange. So my whole kind of thing had been, an ethos has been trying to kind of connect them together. I always wanted to have a gallery. I never knew how I was going to get there. Being a journalist and covering, artists and getting to know artists and having grown this network of artists in London, in the UK, and then abroad. Then working briefly in art PR for, artists in the States as well as the continent. And then, yes, I had my blog. And the blog was fantastic because it was kind of a way for me to kind of go to all these openings. And I then started traveling the continent more to discover artists. And then I just put them up on this blog. And the blog then became very popular, which I found so surprising. And people were really asking me questions on, how to find certain artists, like how can they buy art? And then I found that because I had these relationships with galleries and curators naturally, and these artists, just by being a journalist and also being in PR, I could connect buyers and artists directly. So I naturally became an art dealer. which I then did for a long time. And then when I moved to Ghana 8, 9 years ago, I opened up the gallery. Ghana is a growing art market. I mean, right now it's known as quite a major African art hub now, but I can tell you 5 years ago, 6 years ago, really not. And it was quite strange, growing up, Nigeria is next door, and somewhere that art thrives, and it's such a part of our lives, like it is in like London, Paris, New York. Coming to Ghana, where art is very external, it's very not known. It's nothing that people, they don't consume art as much, even though Ghanaians are naturally very creative people, textiles, music, and creativity, art as in painting, sculptural work. And the best artists, African artists in the world at the moment, most of them are predominantly Ghanaian. But I noticed they all left. They all go to the States.
Why did they leave?
We don't have the infrastructure here. There was no art ecosystem. So a lot of the artists will go to school here, and there were great art schools here. But then in terms of taking their career a step further, they'll go to the West. So I wanted to come back, and I chose to open up shop here rather than Nigeria, where I felt like there was a thriving art market, because Ghana needed more help. We needed more spaces. And by being here, what ended up happening was a lot more artists and a lot more people started coming back home, and a lot more people started opening up spaces. And then suddenly going from nothing really to now a thriving art market.
What does it mean for you to be in the art space as a Black Ghanaian woman?
I'm going to add Nigerian Ghanaian so that my father doesn't get upset. But
okay, sorry.
It is what I will say about it is, arts, I think like most industries, is a very male-dominated industry. It's a very Western male-dominated industry, because I keep telling people I'm not a Ghanaian gallery. I'm an international gallery in Ghana. So I'm competing in the international and the global space. So my gallery is akin to any gallery, as I said, in London, Paris, New York, LA, or wherever else. The difference is I chose to be here to show that one could have an international gallery space on the continent. One could have, the same kind of level and standard that you'd see in a gallery elsewhere. We could do it here. Being a Black woman, an African Black woman, I'd even add, in this industry, has not been easy. But one of the things I have found is, I think this is when I feel that everything kind of works in terms of who I am, and what I was kind of destined for has worked in my favor, because, I grew up in London as well. And, and I went to university in the UK and in New York. So I've kind of always been comfortable in the two worlds. So I felt it almost felt like I was the right person to be in such a space, because I'm not threatened or insecure in white spaces. And I'm not threatened or insecure in African and Black spaces. I feel that I represent my whole continent. I feel that it's a very community led purpose that I have. So using my network and the people I knew from both sides of the world, I just wanted to keep putting these exceptional artists in front of the right faces.
Just to go back to something that you said, I find it really, really interesting, quite poignant actually. You're comfortable in the African Black spaces, and you're also comfortable in the white Western spaces. So you are the connector, basically. How does it feel to be the person to kind of decolonize the art space? And what I mean by that is, because the art industry is it's white, it's Western.
The interesting thing about contemporary art from Africa is that the majority of gatekeepers of contemporary African art do not look like the artists. The majority of the gatekeepers of contemporary art from Africa are white males. I used to have problems going to art fairs, in New York and London and Paris, and walk and seeing these wonderful works of artists that I knew. I knew the context of the work that they were painting and what it meant to them and why they were painting a certain way. And now I'll go into these booths and I'll see these young, boys and few young women, but mainly boys, just almost kind of blasingly, talking about it in this kind of grandiose, but very non-specific way. Like, oh yeah, he was part of a war and he survived the war, and it's like, no, that's
Where's the story?
exactly. But it was almost like it used to frustrate me a lot because, of course, they wouldn't bring their artist over, which they should have done, because sometimes the best person to speak about the work is the artists themselves. But I just found it very bizarre to see these, so-called curators who hadn't done any historical, or didn't care, I would say, to do the historical work or understand the context of their artists. They just want to sell. It was just about sales, and I get that. I do understand artists of business. I really do. But what I found that I felt was very important, and why I needed to do it, was that I understood the narrative and the stories of my people, if that makes, and if I had to say it that way. But it's like I could then translate it and relate it to the audiences, because I felt that was very important. A lot of my collectors, I show very, very young artists. I don't show artists that already have a market. Like, I tend to bring them to market. All the collectors that buy from me are taking a risk, but all of the collectors always tell me that they choose the artist because I tell their story well. Or it is the story and the narrative of the work that suddenly makes that 2, or 3-dimensional painting come to life. And I felt that it's very, very important for people to have ownership of their narrative. I think for far too long, we have been kind of imperialized by the Western narrative of what Africa is and what Africa means. And I think a lot of people are always very pleasantly surprised seeing very young contemporary work and how, one, modern and fresh and quite vibey African artists are, the kind of life we live. It's not all doom and gloom and wars and famine. You know what I mean? Like, even something as simple as that kind of shift in perspective was so important. I just wanted I felt it was important for us to tell our own stories ourselves, because it's a lot more than selling the painting. And our stories are worth telling. They're very compelling and very, very unique and very interesting. Welcome to our world. Welcome to Africa. So, yeah. I think it's important.
Let's talk about the dynamics of the art world between, let's say, the Western world and Africa as well. Like, when did you notice that there was a power dynamic? I mean, for example, there's like a UK law that says you can't return certain stolen artifacts.
Yes.
you can loan it out to Ghana, to Nigeria, or to whatever country they've stolen it from. But they can't give it back.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive issue. It's very difficult because, you see, there's kind of 2 things about it. One, the difficulty about this thing, about the repatriation and like returning of artifacts, is, I have to go a bit historical now. These artifacts they're not museum pieces. They're things that we use in our community. They're not art. You see, we didn't use them as art. They were tools. Whether it was to the spiritual gods or whatever it was, they were never placed in casing. These were things that the community and reacted with and worked with all the time. So we don't consider them art, right? It was when we were colonized that they were considered artwork and they were taken. But what a lot of people don't know is a lot of the palaces and the spaces that these artifacts were placed in were destroyed. So the West is saying that the reason that they cannot return them to Africa is because we don't have the infrastructure and the spaces to preserve the items. They're forgetting that they're the ones that destroyed the places that we used to preserve them. Some historians and African historians even argue that these items are not supposed to be preserved. That was not the point of them. They're supposed to, like every living thing, they're supposed to essentially die, and we rebuild new ones. Like, there's a lot of arguments about this whole kind of encasing and keeping these, the artifacts. But I mean, I know Nigeria has definitely been tougher in the fight, and I think a few items have been returned to the Benin Kingdom. It's Ghana that they're still trying to loan it to, and then stuff, which I find so crazy and absurd. But it's a very sensitive subject for all of us, I think. I think this is beyond art, but I do think we do need to build spaces to protect these things if that's what we want to do. If we really want them back home and we want to protect them And they are being built. As I said, Nigeria is really getting ahead and building some fantastic spaces. But in other parts of Africa, I'm kind of like, where are we going to put them?
Look, you know about the importance of the culture, so, and you clearly know the history, but you also know the business of the art industry and the art scene as well. Is that something that's quite lacking when it comes to the continent? Because I heard you in another interview that the business of art is taught in the West, but when it comes to the continent, they're taught how to be artists.
Exactly.
So how much did that come into play?
It's very true. That it's 100%. So the artists on the continent, art schools here don't teach the whole, how to be an artist in the business sense. They don't teach the economics of art. They teach you how to paint. They don't even teach really how to push your narrative and your artistic practice and to be adventurous. They're really taught every kind of painter and artist on the continent can paint still life like a G. I mean, they will paint it like hyperrealism to a T. But what was most lacking, I felt, was exactly the business of art. Artists here don't understand how to sell, market, and present themselves. And then, some people would argue, well, that's the job of a gallery. Very true. But all artists everywhere else have some notion of the way they want their career to go. I think it's very empowering and important to teach artists about the global art industry so that they don't get shafted, which happens a lot. It doesn't just happen to artists in Africa. It happens to a lot of young artists generally. They understand the uses of museums and why, it's important to have every aspect and all the players in the art industry, from galleries to dealers to auction houses to museums, institutions and patrons and whatnot. Because I felt that they needed to know that, so that they know the kind of artists they want to be. They know what the end goal is, and it again gives them purpose as well to push their practice and to push the kind of artists they want to be.
What themes or what new exciting themes have you seen come out of African art?
What I love about contemporary art from the continent is that it's the same thing everywhere else. The artists are getting a lot more experimental and braver with their practice. I would say a few years ago, there was a very kind of mass surge of Black portraiture and Black figuration, because that's what the global market wanted to see. So everybody was painting Black figures. Seeing, identity was a major, major subject theme. Once you see, faces, suddenly you don't want to see faces anymore. So now there's been kind of I would say a shift in the practice of each artist on the continent, but also I think globally. But there's a lot more surrealism and abstraction and mixed media and photography. Our photography is phenomenal. I think what I'm seeing more and I love as well is that a lot of the artists are just using tools that they have to make work, which I find so fantastic. I mean, the female artists, which are now growing more, which I'm so proud of, because we don't have very many female artists generally, but especially here. But there's a lot more textiles. They're using their hands more. Craft, sculpture, textiles, yarn, sewing, beading, implementing that in their artistry. And I think that is just so incredible to see. So yeah, it's exciting.
You had an exhibition, The Mother of Mankind. How do you create for an exhibition like that? And just tell us more about it, because I know it's very female focused.
It was all female, yes. I mean, it was the first major all-female Black African show in London. It really was. It was a year in preparation. How did I do it? I mean, I've always wanted to do an all-female show. I've always been pro-female anyway, female artists. I'm all about collaborating with the girls, 100%. This year, I think our program this year is 99% female program. But Mother of Mankind was important for me because I wanted to do it in London. I felt that it was very important for London to see that the female artists do well too. At the time, African art was, as I said, it was hot. It was very, very, very hot. But there was a lot of the male artists that were, painting male figures and portraiture. So I wanted to show that we have great female artists too, because I wanted to show female artists from different parts of the world. So even though they all had African heritage, some lived in Canada, London, New York, Paris. Gosh, we had Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, I want Morocco. I wanted them to be African females from all over, their home. And the only thing I told them was I wanted them to paint a work that was almost essentially a self-portraiture of themselves, or something that was very unique to them personally. I wanted the space to feel like we were seeing them within those walls in London, which is what it felt like. So every work was very different and very unique. And most of them did do self-portraiture, which was fantastic, because then it felt like we had these women from all over the world, these artists in this space in Mayfair in London. And what a lot of people loved about that show was the range of artistry that they saw, I loved that. There were some of the artists painted themselves in a younger form, like one of the artists that did very well, Damilola Marcus from Nigeria. One of her works was her and her sister, but her sister was braiding her hair. But a lot of people felt so connected to that work because a lot of us know what that feeling, sitting on the floor, getting your hair braided.
On a Sunday.
It takes you back, right? And she had that beautiful kind of capture of her life and a life of a lot of Black women. Doesn't matter where you're from. Sitting on the floor, getting your hair braided. So I'm very proud of that show. It was almost like I felt like the word I said was like a sisterhood, but I wanted a room of like our sisters, and seeing someone like Jamila Okubo's work, who lives in New York. She's Nigerian but born and bred American, and had this huge, like 7-8 foot painting, of a female Black goddess surrounded by these male figures, like adoring her. And, that was her work. Then you have Emma Premper with her and her grandmother from Ghana. There's narratives of all these women which are connected to the continent, but then have their own unique life. And I think that's what it is about. Like, I feel that this whole kind of Africa is a country kind of vibe, or we're all the same. Everyone is so different. And I think that's what I'm trying to show, with the gallery, with the artists, with everything, that you cannot put us all in a box. Every single artist is completely unique, the same way every human experience is unique. Every artist has their own story they want to tell.
So how do you hope to foster and nurture, I suppose, the next generation of artists, especially female artists?
Well, just keep promoting them, really. I am a woman and I'm an African woman, and I guess I want to see the same way I want to see more of myself in things. I feel like it's important for that narrative to be seen. So I think it's just about pushing the artists as well. A lot of the artists in the continent, unfortunately, are female, tend to have, children or other things. Look, life happens, and I totally understand it. And suddenly they don't want to pick up a paintbrush anymore. So I think what has been wonderful is actually seeing other artists do well and being successful has encouraged a lot more of the female artists to continue to paint, rather than thinking they have to choose. You don't have to choose. You can do both. You can be a mom, and be an artist as well. I think there was always that kind of pressure that one couldn't do both. So it's wonderful for seeing a lot more artists, coming back and then having a new perspective, because they're now mothers, or they're now, wives, or they now have a family, or that something has shifted in their life experience. But it's just kind of encouraging them to know that they can do it. Just, shedding light on their work. Yeah.
Adora, I really appreciate you sharing your story and giving your time to us. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So now you know how one woman is trying to shift the perspective back to African artists and culture while amplifying African voices. A huge thank you to Adora Mba for joining me today, and a special thanks to you for watching and listening to Now You Know.